Picture this. You wake up in complete darkness, your body pressed against cold, damp stone. The air is thick with the stench of human waste, rotting straw, and something else you can't quite identify but hope you never will. Your wrists burn from iron shackles that have rubbed your skin raw. Somewhere in the blackness, you hear the scurrying of rats and the distant moaning of another soul who may have been forgotten down here for months, maybe years. Welcome to your new home, a medieval dungeon. And the question isn't whether you'll suffer. The question is whether you'll live long enough to see daylight again. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of history's darkest chapters. Not the romanticized dungeons of movies and fairy tales, but the real thing, the bone-chilling reality of what it meant to be thrown into the bowels of a medieval castle and left to survive in conditions so horrific that death often felt like mercy. We're talking about places where hope went to die, where the strongest men were reduced to whimpering shadows, and where your social status could mean the difference between a quick death and years of unimaginable torment. Before we descend into this nightmare together, take a moment to subscribe if you find yourself drawn to these dark corners of history. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're exploring these horrors together from the safety of our modern world. Now, dim the lights if you dare. Maybe grab something warm to drink, because we're about to journey into a place where warmth was a luxury most never felt again. The very word dungeon comes from the French donjon, originally meaning the main tower of a castle. But by the late medieval period, it had evolved into something far more sinister. These weren't just holding cells. They were psychological weapons, instruments of terror, designed to break both body and spirit. When Edward I was trying to crush the rebellions in Wales during the late 1200s, he understood that capturing and imprisoning troublemakers was often more effective than simply killing them. His new castles, including the imposing Caernarfon, contained specially designed prisons that would become models of medieval suffering. But who exactly ended up in these nightmarish places? The answer might surprise you. While we often think of dungeons housing hardened criminals, the reality was far more complex and often more tragic. Political, the most common acute prisoners, were perhaps saints, men and women who had simply found themselves on the wrong side of a power struggle. Nobles who had backed the losing side in a civil war. Merchants who had refused to pay excessive taxes. Clergymen who had spoken out against corruption. Their crime wasn't always what they had done, but who they had offended. Heretics formed another significant portion of the prison population. In an age where religious orthodoxy was enforced with iron-fisted brutality, even questioning certain church doctrines could land you in chains. The Inquisition fed these dungeons with a steady stream of accused witches, suspected devil worshippers, and anyone whose beliefs strayed too far from accepted doctrine. Many of these prisoners had committed no crime other than thinking differently or practicing medicine in ways that frightened their neighbors. Common criminals certainly populated the dungeons as well, but medieval justice was often swift and brutal. Thieves might have their hands cut off rather than face long imprisonment. Murderers were typically executed quickly. The dungeons were reserved for those whose punishment needed to be prolonged, whose suffering served a purpose beyond simple justice. They were meant to send a message to anyone else who might consider defying authority. The process of being condemned to a dungeon was often as terrifying as the imprisonment itself. Medieval trials, when they occurred at all, were frequently little more than theatrical performances. Torture was commonly used to extract confessions, and once you were accused of certain crimes, proving your innocence became nearly impossible. The wealthy might buy their way out or negotiate for better conditions, but for the vast majority, a sentence to the dungeon meant disappearing from the world above ground, sometimes forever. Once the heavy door clanged shut behind you, the true horror began. Medieval dungeons were not designed with rehabilitation in mind. They existed to punish, to terrify, and often to kill slowly. The architecture itself, was a form of torture. Built in the deepest parts of castles or carved directly into living rock, these chambers were deliberately placed as far from human civilization as possible. The thick stone walls absorbed sound, meaning your screams would never reach ears that might show mercy. Most dungeon cells were impossibly small, often no more than 6 feet by 8 feet, with ceilings so low that standing upright was impossible. The floors were typically bare stone or packed earth that had been soaked with decades of human waste, blood, and worse. There were no windows, no source of natural light, and certainly no heat. The only illumination came from occasional torches carried by guards, creating dancing shadows that played tricks on minds already strained by isolation and fear. The walls themselves seemed to weep. Moisture constantly seeped through the stones, creating a perpetual dampness that chilled prisoners to their bones. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. The constant humidity encouraged the growth of mold and mildew, which filled the air with spores that attacked already weakened lungs. Many prisoners developed persistent coughs that gradually worsened into consumption, what we now know as tuberculosis. Ventilation was virtually non-existent. The few air shafts that existed were narrow and often blocked, creating an atmosphere thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and human waste. Prisoners were forced to breathe air that was literally toxic, laden with bacteria and disease that would slowly poison their systems. The combination of poor air quality and stress weakened immune systems, making prisoners vulnerable to every illness that passed through the dungeon population. Perhaps most psychologically devastating of all was the darkness. Not the gentle darkness of a bedroom at night, but absolute crushing blackness that seemed to have weight and presence. Prisoners often reported that after weeks or months in total darkness, they began to see things that weren't there. Hallucinations became common, as brains starved of visual input began to create their own images. Some prisoners went blind from the prolonged absence of light, their eyes literally forgetting how to function. The restraints used in medieval dungeons were instruments of torture in themselves. Iron shackles, often weighing 35 pounds or more, were clamped around ankles and wrists. These weren't just meant to prevent escape, they were designed to cause constant pain. The iron would rub against skin and bone, creating wounds that never had a chance to heal. Over time, the constant pressure would cause permanent damage to joints and circulation. Many prisoners were chained in positions that made rest impossible. Some were shackled standing against walls, unable to sit or lie down for days or weeks at a time. Others were forced into crouching positions that caused agonizing muscle cramps and joint pain. The chains were deliberately kept short enough to prevent comfortable movement, ensuring that every moment was filled with physical discomfort that gradually escalated into genuine torture. The psychological impact of these restraints was perhaps even worse than the physical pain. Being chained like an animal stripped away human dignity in the most fundamental way. Prisoners lost control over the most basic aspects of their existence, unable even to scratch an itch or adjust their position for comfort. This complete helplessness often broke spirits faster than any physical torture. Water, that most basic necessity of life, became a precious commodity in the dungeon depths. Most cells had no water source at all. Prisoners depended entirely on their captors for every drop they consumed. And this dependency became another tool of control. Water might be provided once a day, twice, if the prisoner was fortunate or valuable. But often, especially for those who had fallen completely from favour, water came irregularly or not at all. What water prisoners did receive was often contaminated. It might be drawn from the same wells that served the castle above, but by the time it reached the dungeons, it had usually sat in dirty containers for days. Sometimes it was deliberately fouled with waste or allowed to stagnate until it bred disease. Dysentery was rampant in medieval dungeons, spread through contaminated water that prisoners had no choice but to drink or die of thirst. The desperation for water drove prisoners to extremes that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. Many learned to position themselves to catch condensation dripping from stone walls, licking moisture from the very stones of their prison. Others drank their own urine when no other liquid was available, a practice that provided temporary relief, but ultimately hastened death through poisoning. Food in medieval dungeons was a weapon of slow execution. Prisoners might receive a single meal per day, or sometimes go days without any food at all. What little sustenance was provided was deliberately inadequate, designed to keep prisoners alive but weak. The typical prison meal consisted of a small portion of bread, often mouldy and hard as stone, and a thin gruel made from scraps that might have been kitchen waste or grain so spoiled it was unfit for animals. The bread, when it came, was frequently infested with insects or riddled with mould. Prisoners had to choose between eating contaminated food or starving. Most chose to eat whatever they were given, picking out the worst of the mould and hoping their stomachs could handle what remained. This contaminated food was often the source of the intestinal diseases that swept through dungeon populations like wildfire. Meat was virtually unknown in the dungeon diet. On rare occasions, prisoners might receive scraps of fat or gristle that had been deemed inedible even by medieval standards. These morsels, while providing some desperately needed calories, were often rotten and crawling with maggots. Yet prisoners fought over them, their hunger driving them to consume things that would have disgusted them in their former lives. The starvation was deliberately calculated to weaken prisoners both physically and mentally. A starving person cannot think clearly, cannot plan effectively, and certainly cannot mount any kind of resistance. The constant gnawing hunger became an obsession that consumed every waking thought. Prisoners reported dreaming of food, hallucinating elaborate feasts, and becoming so focused on their next meal that they lost track of time and reality. The psychological warfare began the moment you realized that time itself had become your enemy. Without sunlight or any regular schedule of meals, your internal clock started to disintegrate. Days blended into nights, weeks dissolved into months, and eventually many prisoners lost all sense of how long they had been imprisoned. Some discovered years felt later that what like months had actually been decades. This temporal disorientation was not accidental. Medieval jailers understood that breaking a person's connection to time was one of the most effective ways to destroy their sanity. The sounds of the dungeon became a constant torment. The dripping of water echoed endlessly in the darkness, each drop marking time that seemed to stretch into eternity. The scratching of rats in the walls provided a soundtrack of decay and disease. But perhaps most disturbing were the human sounds. The moaning of fellow prisoners, some delirious from fever, others driven mad by isolation. The occasional scream when someone was dragged away for questioning. The wet, rattling coughs of those dying from consumption. And worst of all, the periods of absolute silence when you wondered if you were the only living soul left in this underground hell. Many prisoners began talking to themselves just to hear a human voice, even if it was their own. They would recite prayers, tell stories from their past, or carry on elaborate conversations with imaginary companions. Guard reports from various medieval prisons document prisoners who had created entire fantasy worlds, populated with friends and family members who existed only in their fractured minds. This wasn't mere loneliness. It was the brain's desperate attempt to create human connection when none existed. The arrival of the jailer became the single most important event in a prisoner's day, sometimes their week. These men held absolute power over life and death in the dungeons below. They were typically drawn from the lowest ranks of society, often criminals themselves who had earned their positions through brutality rather than loyalty. Many were illiterate, corrupt, and cruel beyond measure. They supplemented their meagre wages by selling slightly better food to prisoners who could afford it, or by accepting bribes from families desperate to send messages to their imprisoned loved ones. Some jailers took sadistic pleasure in their work. They would deliberately delay food deliveries, watching prisoners beg and plead for sustenance. Others would provide just enough hope to make despair more crushing. A prisoner might be told that their release had been ordered, only to discover it was a lie designed to make their continued imprisonment more psychologically devastating. The power these men wielded was intoxicating, and few resisted the temptation to abuse it. Yet not all jailers were monsters. Some felt genuine sympathy for their charges, and would occasionally show small mercies. An extra piece of bread, a brief moment of conversation, or simply treating prisoners with basic human dignity could mean the difference between maintaining sanity and complete mental collapse. These small acts of humanity were treasured by prisoners and remembered for years, sometimes becoming the only thing that kept them tethered to hope. Corruption was endemic in the medieval prison system. Wealthy prisoners could often buy better conditions, cleaner water, additional food, or even temporary release for special occasions. The Tower of London, for instance, housed many noble prisoners who lived in relative comfort, complete with servants, books, and decent meals. They might have their own chambers, permission to walk in courtyards, and the ability to receive visitors. The contrast between their treatment and that of common prisoners was stark and deliberate. The differences in treatment based on social class were not just about comfort. They were about survival itself. A peasant accused of theft might be thrown into a communal cell with a dozen other prisoners sharing a space barely large enough for 3 people. These cells were breeding grounds for disease, violence, and despair. Prisoners would fight over scraps of food, space to even the right to lean against a wall. The weak sleep or were preyed upon by the strong, creating a hierarchy of suffering that mirrored the social order above ground. Noble prisoners, by contrast, were valuable assets. They could be ransomed, used in political negotiations, or married off to secure alliances. Their survival was economically beneficial to their captors, so they received medical attention when ill, adequate food to maintain their health, and protection from the worst abuses. Some noble prisoners even continued to conduct business from their cells, maintaining correspondence and managing their estates through intermediaries. Disease moved through medieval dungeons like an invisible army, striking down prisoners already weakened by starvation and despair. Tuberculosis was perhaps the most feared killer, spreading rapidly in the close quarters and poor ventilation of underground cells. The disease, known then as consumption, would begin with a persistent cough that gradually worsened. Prisoners would cough up blood, lose weight rapidly, and eventually waste away to nothing. The lack of sunlight and fresh air made recovery virtually impossible. Dysentery was another common killer, spread through contaminated food and water. The disease caused violent diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration. In the unsanitary conditions of medieval dungeons, where waste accumulated in corners and fresh water was scarce, dysentery could sweep through an entire prison population in a matter of days. The symptoms were particularly horrifying for prisoners who were already weakened by malnutrition and could not replace the fluids they lost. Skin diseases were endemic in the filthy conditions. Scabies, spread by tiny mites that burrowed into the skin, caused intense itching and infected sores. With no way to wash or change clothes, prisoners scratched themselves raw, creating open wounds that became infected. Lice infested hair and clothing, carrying typhus and other diseases. Even minor cuts or scrapes could become life-threatening infections without proper care. The psychological symptoms of prolonged imprisonment were as devastating as the physical diseases. Modern research on solitary confinement shows that over 90% of prisoners in isolation develop severe anxiety and nervousness. Medieval prisoners, facing similar conditions but without any understanding of mental health, experienced the same psychological breakdown. They became paranoid, hearing voices and seeing things that weren't there. Many developed what we would now recognize as severe depression, losing all will to live and refusing to eat even when food was available. Sleep became either impossible or the only escape from reality. Some prisoners developed insomnia, lying awake in the darkness for days at a time, their minds racing with fears and memories. Others retreated into sleep as much as possible, sometimes for 20 hours a day, using unconsciousness as their only refuge from the horror of their situation. Both extremes were dangerous, as sleep deprivation weakened the immune system, while excessive sleep led to muscle atrophy and further psychological deterioration. The most extreme form of medieval imprisonment was the oubliette, from the French word meaning to forget. These were vertical shafts, often bottle-shaped, accessible only through a trapdoor in the ceiling high above. Prisoners were lowered into these chambers and literally forgotten. The oubliette at Warwick Castle was particularly notorious, with sharp, jagged stones jutting up from the floor that made it impossible to find any position of comfort. Prisoners were forced to remain standing or lie prone on the cutting stones, with the ceiling so low they could not sit upright. The oubliette was designed to be a death sentence that took months or years to carry out. Food and water might be lowered occasionally, just enough to prolong the agony. Some oubliettes contained the bones of multiple prisoners, evidence that they had been used repeatedly over the centuries. The psychological impact of being trapped in such a space was immediate and devastating. The complete inability to escape, combined with the physical pain and isolation, drove most prisoners insane within days or weeks. Ireland's Leap Castle contained one of the most horrific oubliettes ever discovered. When the castle changed hands in the 17th century, the new owners found dozens of impaled skeletons in the dungeon below the bloody chapel. 3 cartloads of bones were reportedly removed, evidence of the systematic murder of prisoners over many years. The discovery provided chilling proof of how these forgotten chambers had been used not just for imprisonment, but for disposal of unwanted individuals. Torture was not just a method of extracting confessions in medieval dungeons. It was also used as punishment, intimidation, and entertainment for those who wielded power over the prisoners. The rack was perhaps the most common torture device, consisting of a wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim's wrists and ankles were secured to opposite rollers, and the device was slowly cranked to stretch the body beyond its natural limits. The process was designed to dislocate joints gradually, causing excruciating pain while avoiding immediate death. The wooden horse was another particularly cruel device. Prisoners were forced to straddle a sharp-edged wooden beam, with weights tied to their legs to increase the pressure on their groin and internal organs. The torture could continue for hours or even days, causing permanent damage and often death from internal injuries. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical pain, as victims knew that any movement would increase their agony. The Judas cradle represented the pinnacle of sadistic creativity. This pyramid-shaped device was designed so that prisoners would be slowly lowered onto its point, which would gradually pierce intimate parts of their anatomy. The victim's hands and feet were bound to prevent them from shifting their weight, meaning that gravity itself became the instrument of torture. The process could take days, with the prisoner experiencing increasing pain as their own body weight drove them further onto the spike. These torture devices were not just tools of interrogation, they served as psychological weapons against all prisoners. The knowledge that such devices existed in the castle above created an atmosphere of constant terror even. Prisoners who were never tortured lived in fear that they might be selected for such treatment. Guards would often describe the tortures in graphic detail, or even force prisoners to watch as fellow inmates were subjected to these devices. The records from medieval courts show that torture was considered a legitimate part of the justice system. Confessions extracted under torture were accepted as legal evidence, even though many officials understood that people would say anything to stop the pain. The church even provided theological justification for torture, arguing that saving a person's soul through confession was worth any amount of physical suffering. This religious sanction made the practice not just legal, but morally necessary in the minds of medieval authorities. For those prisoners who somehow survived their initial imprisonment, the question became not just physical survival, but maintaining their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Some found strength in religious faith, spending their days in prayer and meditation. Others focused on memories of their former lives, clinging to thoughts of family and friends as anchors to their identity. A few even found ways to help fellow prisoners, sharing what little food they had or providing comfort to those who were dying. But the vast majority of prisoners slowly deteriorated, both physically and mentally. The combination of starvation, disease, torture, and isolation was designed to break the human spirit completely. Those who emerged from medieval dungeons, if they emerged at all, were often unrecognizable as the people they had once carried been. They had physical scars, psychological trauma, and a fundamental change in their understanding of human nature that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The question of whether you could survive a medieval dungeon was not just about physical endurance. It was about whether you could maintain your sanity, your humanity, and your will to live in conditions designed to strip away everything that made you human. Most could not. The medieval dungeon was not just a prison. It was a machine designed to destroy people, one agonizing day at a time. The reality of dungeon life meant that survival often depended on factors completely beyond a prisoner's control. Your fate might hinge on whether the castle's current lord was feeling merciful, whether your family could scrape together enough coin for bribes, or simply whether the guard assigned to your section had eaten a decent meal that day. These weren't places governed by law or justice as we understand them today. They were kingdoms unto themselves, ruled by men who answered to no one and wielded power over life and death with casual indifference. The guards who controlled these underground realms were often as trapped as their prisoners, just on the other side of the bars. Most were recruited from the dregs of society, men who had few other options for employment. Some were former soldiers who had lost limbs or suffered injuries that made them unfit for active duty. Others were criminals themselves, offered the choice between prison and becoming a jailer. A few were simply desperate men with families to feed who were willing to do anything for steady wages. These men lived in a world that existed somewhere between the civilized castle above and the hellish dungeons below. They slept in cramped quarters near the prison cells, breathing the same foul air and listening to the same sounds of suffering night after night. Many developed a callousness that bordered on cruelty, not out of natural sadism, but as a psychological defense against the horror they witnessed daily. To maintain any semblance of sanity, they had to convince themselves that the prisoners deserved their fate. The corruption that flourished in this environment was inevitable. Guards earned pitifully small wages, barely enough to survive on. The temptation to supplement their income through bribes and extortion was overwhelming. A guard might demand payment for bringing a prisoner an extra cup of water or threaten to withhold food unless family members provided additional compensation. Some became entrepreneurs of suffering, creating elaborate schemes to extract money from desperate relatives. Letters were a particularly lucrative business. Family members would pay enormous sums to send messages to imprisoned loved ones, and guards would charge even more to ensure those messages were actually delivered. Some guards couldn't read, so they might accept payment for a letter and simply throw it away, leaving families to wonder why their imprisoned relative never responded. Others would read letters aloud to groups of prisoners, turning private communications into public humiliation. The most valuable commodity a guard could offer was information. Families desperate for news about their imprisoned relatives would pay anything to learn whether their loved one was still alive. Guards would often lie, claiming prisoners were doing well when they were actually dying, or demanding additional payments for more detailed reports. Some guards would even stage fake visits, describing conversations with prisoners who had actually been dead for months. But corruption owed both FL ways in the medieval prison system. Wealthy prisoners learned quickly that money could buy almost anything, even in the darkest dungeons. A sufficient bribe might secure a cell with a window, access to writing materials, or permission to receive visitors. Some prisoners essentially rented better accommodations within the prison, paying monthly fees for cleaner cells, better food, and protection from other inmates. The most successful prisoners became power brokers within the dungeon hierarchy. They would loan money to guards, organize gambling operations, and even run protection rackets among fellow prisoners. These prison entrepreneurs understood that survival often depended on making yourself valuable to your captors. A prisoner who could provide useful information about other inmates or who had connections to wealthy families outside might find their conditions improving dramatically. The Catholic Church played a complex role in medieval imprisonment, sometimes providing the only source of mercy prisoners would encounter, but just as often justifying the cruelest punishments. Priests were regular visitors to dungeons, ostensibly to provide spiritual comfort and hear final confessions. Some genuinely tried to ease prisoners' suffering, smuggling in food or medicine and advocating for better treatment. These clerical visits were often the only human contact prisoners had with someone who wasn't actively trying to harm them. However, the Church also provided theological justification for many of the worst aspects of medieval imprisonment. Torture was considered acceptable if it led to confession and salvation of the soul. Suffering was viewed as purification, a necessary step in preparing the sinner for redemption. This religious framework made guards and administrators feel righteous about inflicting pain, transforming cruelty into a holy duty. The process of confession in medieval dungeons was often more torture than spiritual comfort. Priests would pressure dying prisoners to admit to crimes they hadn't committed, threatening eternal damnation if they didn't confess. These forced confessions served multiple purposes, providing legal justification for imprisonment while also reinforcing the Church's authority over matters of life and death. Heresy trials created some of the most horrific dungeon conditions of the medieval period. The Inquisition filled prisons across Europe with accused witches, devil worshippers, and religious dissidents. These prisoners were subjected to particularly brutal treatment, as their crimes were considered not just violations of earthly law, but offences against God himself. The torture used to extract confessions from suspected heretics was systematic and prolonged, designed to break both body and spirit completely. Women prisoners faced additional horrors that their male counterparts were spared. Sexual assault was common, perpetrated not just by guards, but sometimes by fellow prisoners. Pregnant women who gave birth in dungeons faced impossible choices, as their newborns had virtually no chance of survival in the toxic environment. Some women would attempt to kill their children rather than watch them suffer and die slowly from disease and starvation. Female prisoners were often housed in the worst sections of dungeons, given smaller rations than men, and subjected to forms of humiliation designed specifically to break feminine dignity. They were forced to endure monthly cycles without any privacy or sanitary provisions, adding another layer of degradation to their imprisonment. Many women prisoners were accused of witchcraft, a charge that carried particularly severe punishments and often involved specialized torture devices designed to extract confessions of supernatural crimes. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life affected even the deepest dungeons. Winter brought bone-chilling cold that penetrated the thickest stone walls. Prisoners huddled together for warmth, often finding that body heat was the only thing standing between them and death from exposure. Thed made cold every other aspect of imprisonment worse, turning damp clothes into ice-crusted torture devices and making already inadequate food rations even harder to digest. Summer brought different torments. The lack of ventilation made dungeons unbearably hot and stuffy. The combination of high temperatures and poor sanitation created perfect breeding conditions for disease-carrying insects. Flies swarmed in clouds so thick they could barely be waved away, laying eggs in open wounds and contaminating what little food prisoners received. The stench became almost unbearable as bodies decomposed more rapidly in the heat. Spring floods were a constant threat to dungeons built below ground level, water would seep through stone walls and rise from the floor, sometimes reaching knee-deep levels that persisted for weeks. Prisoners would be forced to stand in contaminated water that carried sewage, dead animals, and human waste from the castle above. These floods brought cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases that could kill entire prison populations within days. The harvest season determined the quality and quantity of food available to prisoners. Good harvests might mean slightly larger rations and fresher bread, while crop failures could mean weeks without any food at all. Prisoners learned to recognize the signs of approaching famine by the increasingly desperate looks on their guards' faces. When food became scarce throughout the castle, prisoners were always the first to suffer. Medical care in medieval dungeons was virtually non-existent, but not entirely absent. Some castles employed physicians who were occasionally called to treat valuable prisoners. These doctors worked impossible under conditions, trying to heal people in environments that were actively making them sicker. They might set broken bones or treat infected wounds, but without the ability to remove patients from the source of disease and contamination, their efforts were largely futile. Barber surgeons sometimes visited PR performers to crude operations or amputations. These procedures were conducted without anesthesia or proper surgical tools, using whatever implements were available. Many prisoners died from these attempted treatments, but some preferred the risk of surgery to the certainty of slow death from infection. The sight of these operations, performed in front of other prisoners, added another layer of psychological terror to dungeon life. Some guards developed crude medical knowledge through experience, learning to recognize the symptoms of various diseases and understanding which prisoners were likely to survive. This knowledge was often used for economic rather than humanitarian purposes. Guards might provide basic medical care to prisoners whose families were paying bribes, while allowing others to die from easily treatable conditions. The concept of time took on a completely different meaning in the perpetual darkness of medieval dungeons. Without sun or clocks, prisoners lost all sense of day and night, weeks and months. Some tried to maintain calendars by scratching marks into stone walls, but the effort often became meaningless as their mental state deteriorated. The passage of time was measured instead by the rhythm of meals, the changing of guards, or the gradual progression of diseases through the prison population. This temporal disorientation was perhaps one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of dungeon imprisonment. Humans need structure and routine to maintain mental health, but dungeon life deliberately destroyed these patterns. Prisoners never knew when they might be fed, when guards might appear, or when they might be dragged away for questioning. This unpredictability created a state of constant anxiety that wore down psychological resistance as effectively as any physical torture. Some prisoners attempted to create their own routines as a form of mental survival. They might recite prayers at regular intervals, perform simple exercises when their chains allowed, or tell themselves stories to mark the passage of time. These self-imposed structures were fragile lifelines that could be shattered by any disruption in prison routine, but they represented the human spirit's desperate attempt to maintain some sense of control in an utterly powerless situation. The social dynamics within dungeon cells created complex hierarchies based on factors that would have seemed absurd in the world above ground. Physical strength still mattered, as it did everywhere in medieval society, but other qualities became equally important. A prisoner who could read might achieve higher status by interpreting letters or legal documents. Someone with medical knowledge, however crude, might be protected by fellow prisoners who hoped to benefit from their skills. Age played a crucial role in prison hierarchies. Older prisoners who had survived for extended periods commanded respect and fear in equal measure. They had learned the unwritten rules of dungeon survival and could serve as mentors to newer arrivals. However, elderly prisoners were also viewed with suspicion, as their longevity might indicate that they were informants or collaborators who had earned better treatment through betrayal. Religious devotion became a survival strategy for many prisoners. Those who could recite prayers or portions of scripture might find themselves protected by guards who feared divine retribution for harming holy men. Some prisoners claim to have received visions or divine messages, establishing themselves as spiritual leaders within the prison community. These religious roles provided both psychological comfort and practical protection, though they could also make prisoners targets for accusations of heresy. The arrival of new prisoners was always a significant event in the closed world of the dungeon. Newcomers brought news from the outside world, information about political events, family members, or changes in local leadership. They also represented fresh opportunities for exploitation by established prisoners who had learned the brutal economics of survival. New arrivals might be robbed of any possessions they carried, forced to give up better clothing, or coerced into sharing food rations. Veteran prisoners developed elaborate initiation rituals for newcomers, partly as a form of entertainment in their monotonous existence, but also as a way of establishing dominance and extracting resources. These rituals might involve physical challenges, humiliating performances, or tests of courage designed to determine where the new prisoner would fit in the existing hierarchy. The psychological pressure of these initiations often broke newcomers before the physical conditions of the prison had a chance to wear them down. The most successful prison survivors learned to read the subtle signs that indicated changes in their circumstances. They could tell from a guard's demeanor whether political winds were shifting above ground, potentially affecting their own fate. They recognized the early symptoms of diseases that might spread through the prison population, allowing them to take whatever crude protective measures were possible. Most importantly, they developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when violence was imminent, whether from guards, fellow prisoners, or the arrival of torture specialists from other locations. Communication between prisoners was often conducted through elaborate codes and whispered conversations that had to avoid detection by guards. Prisoners developed their own languages, mixing regional dialects with prison slang and coded references that would be meaningless to outsiders. These communication networks allowed information to spread rapidly through prison populations, warning of impending dangers or sharing news about the outside world. The psychological profiles of long-term dungeon survivors revealed common traits that had little to do with their original social status or the crimes that had brought them to prison. Successful survivors were often those who could maintain hope while simultaneously accepting the reality of their situation. They neither gave up completely nor wasted energy on futile escape fantasies. Instead, they focused on the small daily choices that might incrementally improve their chances of survival. Mental flexibility became crucial for long-term survival. Prisoners who clung too rigidly to their former identities or social expectations often broke down completely when faced with the degrading realities of dungeon life. Those who could adapt, who could find meaning and even moments of satisfaction in their reduced circumstances, were more likely to maintain their sanity through years of imprisonment. This adaptation came at a cost, however, as many survivors found themselves fundamentally changed people who could never fully readjust to life outside prison walls. The economic impact of medieval imprisonment extended far beyond the castle walls. Families of prisoners often bankrupted themselves trying to secure better treatment for their loved ones. They sold land, borrowed money at ruinous interest rates, and sometimes committed crimes themselves in desperate attempts to raise funds for bribes. Entire communities could be impoverished by the imprisonment of important local figures, as their absence disrupted trade, agricultural production, and local governance. Some families simply abandoned imprisoned relatives, unable or unwilling to bear the financial and social costs of association with convicted criminals. Children of prisoners might be cast out from their communities, forced to become beggars or criminals themselves. Wives of imprisoned men faced impossible choices between loyalty to their husbands and the practical need to remarry for economic survival. The social stigma of having a family member in prison could persist for generations, affecting marriage prospects and business relationships. The records that survive from medieval prisons provide glimpses into individual stories that illustrate the broader patterns of suffering and survival. The Tower of London's records mention a prisoner named John Balliol, who was held for over 20 years, gradually losing his sanity but somehow maintaining enough political value to be kept alive. Other documents describe prisoners who died within days of their arrival, unable to cope with the sudden transition from comfortable lives to dungeon conditions. These individual cases reveal the arbitrary nature of medieval justice and the role that luck played in determining survival. Some prisoners were forgotten in their cells and left to die when their guards were reassigned or killed in wars. Others were unexpectedly released when political situations changed or when their captors needed to make gestures of mercy for diplomatic reasons. The difference between life and death often came down to factors completely beyond any prisoner's control. Archaeological evidence from medieval prison sites supports and sometimes contradicts the written records. Excavations have uncovered evidence of the brutal conditions described in contemporary accounts, including piles of human bones showing signs of malnutrition and disease. However, archaeologists have also found evidence of prisoner crafts, makeshift tools, and even primitive artwork scratched into stone walls, suggesting that some inmates maintained creative and productive activities despite their circumstances. The physical remains of medieval prisons continue to reveal new information about the daily realities of dungeon life. Chemical analysis of soil samples from prison floors has confirmed the presence of human waste, blood, and various toxins that would have made these spaces nearly uninhabitable. Bone analysis reveals patterns of disease, malnutrition, and physical abuse that paint a picture of systematic brutality that was even worse than contemporary written accounts suggested. As we examine these archaeological findings and historical records, the question of survival becomes even more complex. The medieval dungeon was not just a test of physical endurance or mental fortitude. It was a comprehensive assault on every aspect of human existence, designed to strip away dignity, hope, and ultimately life itself. Those few who survived did so not through any heroic qualities or superior moral character, but through a combination of luck, adaptability, and the kind of compromises that fundamentally changed who they were as human beings. The survivors carried scars that went far deeper than the physical marks left by chains and torture devices. They emerged from the darkness changed in ways that affected every relationship, every decision, and every moment of their remaining lives. In many ways, the question is not whether you could survive a medieval dungeon, but whether the person who emerged would still recognizably be you. The weight of survival in a medieval dungeon wasn't measured in days or weeks, but in the gradual erosion of everything that had once defined you as a human being. Each morning, if morning even had meaning in that perpetual darkness, brought the same crushing realization that you were still alive, still breathing the putrid air, still feeling the bite of iron against your flesh. And with each passing moment, the person you had been before those doors clanged shut became more distant, more like a dream you could barely remember. The routine of imprisonment, such as it was, revolved around the unpredictable moods and needs of your captors. Guards might appear once a day, twice a week, or not at all for stretches that felt like eternity. Their arrivals were announced by the scraping of keys, the echo of footsteps in stone corridors, and sometimes the drunken laughter of men who had found entertainment in the suffering of others. These sounds became the most important events in a prisoner's existence, marking time and bringing either the possibility of food or the certainty of fresh torment. The guards themselves were products of a system that brutalized everyone it touched. Many had been recruited from taverns and brothels, places where violence was currency and mercy was weakness. Others were disabled soldiers who could no longer fight but retained enough strength to intimidate chained prisoners. A few were local criminals who had been offered the choice between hanging and employment in the castle dungeons. These men understood violence intimately, having lived with it their entire lives, and they brought that understanding to their work with enthusiasm. The corruption that flourished in this environment was as inevitable as disease in stagnant water. A guard earning a few copper coins per month could multiply his income tenfold by accepting bribes from desperate families. The going rate for an extra cup of water might be a week's wages for a common labourer. A promise to deliver a message could cost a family their savings. And the promise that such messages would actually be delivered was worth exactly nothing, as most guards understood that hope was more valuable than truth when it came to extracting payments from relatives. The most successful guards became entrepreneurs of human misery. They would establish relationships with moneylenders, tavern keepers, and merchants who could help them convert their extorted wealth into property and influence. Some retired from dungeon work as relatively wealthy men, having built their fortunes on the systematic exploitation of human suffering. Others drank themselves to death, unable to escape the psychological toll of their profession even when they had accumulated enough wealth to live comfortably. The relationship between prisoner and guard was not simply one of victim and oppressor. Over time, a complex dynamic would develop that resembled nothing so much as a twisted form of marriage. Prisoners learned to read their guards' moods as carefully as wives studied their husbands, understanding that survival might depend on knowing when to grovel, when to remain silent, and when to offer whatever small services or information they possessed. Guards, in turn, developed preferences among their charges, protecting certain prisoners while abandoning others to die. This relationship was built on a foundation of absolute power imbalance, but it contained elements that might almost be mistaken for human connection. A guard might share news from the outside world with a prisoner who had been cooperative, or provide an extra portion of food to someone who had entertained him with stories or songs. These small mercies were never acts of kindness in any meaningful sense, but rather the whims of someone who enjoyed exercising power over life and death. The most dangerous guards were those who had developed genuine affection for their work. These men didn't torture prisoners out of cruelty or for profit, but because they had found a calling that satisfied some deep psychological need. They approached their duties with the dedication of craftsmen, studying different methods of inflicting pain and experimenting with techniques designed to maximize suffering while preventing death. These guards were often the most educated men in the prison system, having read treatises on torture and interrogation that had been passed down through generations of professional torturers. The seasonal rhythms that governed life in the castle above had profound effects on conditions in the dungeons below. Winter brought not just cold, but a kind of hibernation that affected everyone in the prison system. Food became scarce throughout the castle, and prisoners' rations were reduced to starvation levels. Guards became more irritable and violent as they dealt with their own discomfort and reduced wages. The stone walls seemed to absorb cold and radiate it back, creating an environment where hypothermia was a constant threat. But winter also brought a strange form of mercy. The cold slowed the spread of disease, reduced the activity of insects and vermin, and made the stench of human waste slightly more bearable. Some prisoners actually looked forward to the winter months, understanding that while they might freeze to death, they were less likely to die from the fevers and plagues that swept through prison populations during warmer weather. Spring floods were perhaps the most terrifying natural disaster that could befall a dungeon population. When rivers overflowed or heavy rains overwhelmed castle drainage systems, water would pour into underground chambers with devastating effect. Prisoners chained to walls might find themselves standing in waist-deep water for days or weeks, unable to sit or lie down, watching as weaker inmates drowned in their shackles. The water carried sewage, dead animals, and toxic waste from the castle above, creating a poisonous soup that caused infections, blindness, and death from contamination. Those who survived spring floods often emerged with their feet and legs permanently damaged from prolonged exposure to contaminated water. Gangrene was common, and many flood survivors faced amputation or death from blood poisoning in the months that followed. The floods also destroyed whatever meager possessions prisoners might have accumulated, washing away hidden food stores, makeshift tools, and the small personal items that helped maintain psychological connections to their former lives. Summer brought its own unique torments. The combination of heat, humidity, and poor ventilation created conditions that were almost unendurable. Prisoners would strip clothing off whatever they had, desperate to find relief from temperatures that could reach dangerous levels in the stone chambers. But nakedness brought its own problems, leaving prisoners vulnerable to insect bites, skin infections, and the psychological humiliation of complete exposure to guards and fellow inmates. The heat also accelerated the decomposition of bodies, creating health hazards that affected entire prison populations. Dead prisoners might lie in their cells for days or weeks before guards bothered to remove them, and the resulting stench and disease could make adjacent cells uninhabitable. Some prisoners were forced to share their living space with decomposing corpses, creating psychological trauma that lasted for those who somehow survived the experience. Autumn was harvest time in the world above, and the quality of prison food would improve as fresh slightly also brought preparation became available. But grain autumn for winter, and guards would often reduce prisoner rations in order to stockpile food for the cold months ahead. The irony was cruel but typical of medieval prison logic. Prisoners were starved when food was most plentiful, in order to ensure that something would be available when food became scarce. The religious calendar that governed medieval life penetrated even into the deepest dungeons, though often in perverted forms that would have been unrecognizable to faithful Christians above ground. Christmas might bring slightly better food or a reduction in torture sessions, but it might also bring visits from priests who demanded confessions of sins that prisoners had not committed. Easter could mean temporary reprieves from the harshest punishments, but it might also mean increased pressure to confess heresies or to implicate fellow prisoners in imaginary crimes. Holy days were sometimes used as opportunities for public displays of justice that served more as entertainment than legal proceedings. Prisoners might be dragged from their cells to face public humiliation in castle courtyards, forced to confess their crimes before crowds of nobles and servants. These confessions were rarely voluntary, having been extracted through torture or threats against family members, but they served the important function of reinforcing the authority of the ruling class while providing spectacle for the masses. The role of women in medieval prison systems was complex and often contradictory. Female prisoners faced unique vulnerabilities that made their survival even more precarious than that of their male counterparts. Sexual assault was not just common, but expected, perpetrated by guards who viewed access to female prisoners as one of the perquisites of their position. Pregnancy in prison was often that death sentence, as the conditions barely sustained adult life were completely inadequate for supporting the development of a child. Yet women also possessed certain advantages that could be crucial for survival. They were sometimes viewed as less threatening than male prisoners, leading to slightly better treatment or reduced security measures. Female prisoners might be allowed to perform domestic tasks for guards or prison administrators, providing opportunities to earn small favors or gather information about conditions in other parts of the prison. Some women were able to use their sexuality strategically, forming relationships with guards that provided protection and better access to food and medicine. The presence of women in medieval prisons also created complex social dynamics among male prisoners. Some men appointed themselves protectors of female inmates, forming alliances that could provide mutual support and protection. Others viewed women as resources to be exploited or traded, leading to conflicts that could turn deadly in the confined space of prison cells. The competition for access to women could create hierarchies and power structures that had little to do with the crimes that had brought prisoners to the dungeon in the first place. Children in medieval prisons faced perhaps the most hopeless situations of all. The concept of juvenile justice did not exist in medieval legal systems, and children as young as 7 or 8 could be imprisoned for theft, vagrancy, or simply being related to accused criminals. These young prisoners rarely survived more than a few months in dungeon conditions, succumbing to diseases that their undeveloped immune systems could not fight off. The few children who did survive often did so by attaching themselves to adult prisoners who served as surrogate parents and protectors. These relationships were fraught with danger, as adult prisoners might view children as burdens who consumed precious resources, or as valuable assets who could be sold or traded to guards for favors. Some children survived by becoming servants to more powerful prisoners, performing tasks like cleaning, message carrying, or even prostitution in exchange for protection and food. The psychological development of children who survived extended periods in medieval dungeons was invariably war experiences, shaped by their learned to view violence, deprivation, and exploitation as normal parts of human interaction. Many became sociopaths who felt no empathy for others, having had their own capacity for emotional connection destroyed by trauma and neglect. Those who were eventually released often became criminals themselves, having learned no other way to survive in a world they viewed as fundamentally hostile and dangerous. The economic systems that developed within medieval prisons were as complex as any found in the legitimate commercial world above ground. Prisoners with access to money or valuable information could establish themselves as power brokers who controlled access to resources and protection. They might loan food to hungry inmates at usurious rates, demand payment for providing information about guard schedules, or charge fees for access to the best sleeping spaces in overcrowded cells. These prison economies were built on currencies that would have been worthless in the outside world. A piece of relatively clean cloth might be traded for information about a guard's mood. A small tool hidden from searchers could be rented out for specific tasks. Even human waste had value, as it could be used to create conditions that would force guards to relocate prisoners to different cells. The most successful prison entrepreneurs understood that scarcity created value, and they worked to control access to anything that might improve a prisoner's chances of survival. The information networks that developed within prison systems were remarkably sophisticated, considering the limitations imposed by isolation and surveillance. Prisoners developed elaborate codes that could be communicated through coughing patterns, scratching sounds, or the arrangement of straw in cell corners. These codes allowed them to warn each other about impending raids, share news about conditions in other parts of the prison, and coordinate resistance to particularly abusive guards. The most valuable information concerned the political situations that had led to various imprisonments. A prisoner who understood the broader context of his incarceration was better positioned to predict changes in his treatment or to identify opportunities for release or escape. This knowledge could also be traded to other prisoners or even to guards, creating complex webs of information exchange that resembled nothing so much as primitive intelligence operations. The medical knowledge that developed within prison populations was necessarily crude, but often surprisingly effective. Prisoners learned to recognize the early symptoms of various diseases, to treat wounds with whatever materials were available, and to provide comfort to the dying in ways that preserved some measure of human dignity. This knowledge was passed down orally from veteran prisoners to newcomers, creating informal medical traditions that helped slightly improve survival rates. Some prisoners discovered that certain herbs or substances could be obtained from guards or smuggled in by visitors, and they became prison doctors who treated fellow inmates in exchange for protection or food. These amateur physicians worked without proper tools or medicines, using techniques that were often as dangerous as the conditions they were trying to treat. But even crude medical care was better than none at all, and prisoners who could provide healing services often found themselves protected by informal coalitions of grateful patients. The religious practices that emerged in medieval dungeons were often syncretic mixtures of Christian doctrine, folk superstition, and desperate improvisation. Prisoners who could not read might create their own versions of familiar prayers, mixing half-remembered Bible verses with magical incantations and personal pleas for survival. These practices provided psychological comfort and helped maintain some connection to the spiritual world that meaning had given to their lives before imprisonment. Some prisoners claimed to have received divine visions or messages that provided guidance for survival or predicted future events. These claims were sometimes genuine expressions of psychological breakdown, but they were also strategic performances designed to establish authority within prison hierarchies. A prisoner who was believed to have special access to divine knowledge might be protected and supported by fellow inmates who hoped to benefit from prophetic insights. The arrival of genuine priests in medieval dungeons was always a significant event, though not always a welcome one. Some clerics were genuinely committed to providing spiritual comfort and practical assistance to prisoners. They might smuggle in food, medicine, or messages from family members, and they could sometimes intercede with prison authorities on behalf of particularly sympathetic cases. These priests risked their own safety and careers by showing mercy to condemned criminals, and their efforts occasionally made the difference between life and death for desperate prisoners. However, many clerical visits were less benevolent in nature. Priests were often sent to extract confessions that would justify harsh sentences or implicate other suspects. They might threaten prisoners with eternal damnation if they refused to admit to crimes they had not committed, using spiritual terror as a tool of interrogation that was often more effective than physical torture. The sight of a priest entering a prison cell could therefore provoke either hope or despair, depending on his mission and the prisoner's understanding of the political currents flowing through the castle above. The concept of time underwent a fundamental transformation in the environment of the medieval dungeon. Without natural light or regular schedules, prisoners lost their connection to the daily rhythms that had previously structured their lives. Days and nights became meaningless concepts, replaced by the irregular patterns of guard visits, meal deliveries, and the biological imperatives of hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. This temporal disorientation had profound psychological effects that went beyond mere confusion about dates or seasons. Prisoners found themselves unable to plan or hope in any meaningful way, as they could not predict when their circumstances might change, or even whether change was possible. The future became an abstract concept that had no practical relevance to the immediate problems of survival, while the past began to feel like a dream that might never have actually occurred. Some prisoners attempted to maintain their connection to normal time by creating elaborate mental calendars based on their memories of seasonal festivals, religious holidays, or significant family events. They would count days by scratching marks into stone walls or by reciting prayers at regular intervals. But these efforts often collapsed under the weight of uncertainty and despair, leaving prisoners even more disoriented than before as they realized how completely they had lost track of their place in the world. The social hierarchies that emerged within prison populations were based on factors that bore little resemblance to the class structures of medieval society above ground. Physical strength remained important, but it was often less crucial than intelligence, adaptability, or access to resources from the outside world. A peasant who could read might achieve higher status than a knight who had been stripped of his wealth and connections. An elderly prisoner who had survived for years might command more respect than a young noble who was still adjusting to the realities of dungeon life. These prison hierarchies were constantly shifting as circumstances changed and new prisoners arrived. A single piece of information about political developments could dramatically alter someone's status within the prison community. The death of a guard who had been protecting certain prisoners could lead to violent struggles for control of resources and territory. Even small changes in prison routine could disrupt established relationships and force prisoners to renegotiate their positions within the social structure. The most successful prisoners were those who could navigate these complex social dynamics while maintaining their focus on the primary goal of survival. They learned to form alliances that provided mutual benefit without creating dependencies that could become liabilities. They understood when to assert dominance and when to submit to more powerful prisoners. Most importantly, they recognized that survival often required making moral compromises that would have been unthinkable in their previous lives. The psychological adaptation required for long-term survival in a medieval dungeon involved fundamental changes in personality, values, and worldview. Prisoners had to abandon many of the social norms and moral principles that had guided their behavior in the outside world, adopting instead a pragmatic focus on immediate survival needs. Concepts like honor, loyalty, and compassion became luxuries that few could afford in an environment where any display of weakness could be fatal. This psychological transformation was often irreversible, creating individuals who could never fully readjust to normal society, even if they were eventually released. Former prisoners might retain the hypervigilance, paranoia, and emotional numbness that had helped them survive in the dungeons, long after those traits had ceased to be useful or appropriate. They often found it impossible to form normal relationships or to trust others, having learned that any human connection could be exploited or weaponized by those in power. The few detailed records that survive from specific medieval prisons provide glimpses into individual stories that illuminate the broader patterns of suffering and survival. Tower. The of London's archives contain references to prisoners who survived for decades in various states of physical and mental deterioration. Some maintained their sanity by focusing on intellectual pursuits, composing poetry or treatises that they scratched into stone walls with whatever tools they could improvise. Others retreated into madness as a form of psychological escape from unbearable conditions. One particularly poignant case involves a prisoner identified only as William the Scribe, who was imprisoned in the Tower for unknown crimes sometime in the early 14th century. The records show that he survived for over 15 years, during which time he created an elaborate system of markings on his cell walls that appeared to be attempts to record everything he could remember about his life before imprisonment. These markings covered every available surface and represented what may have been his effort to maintain his identity and sanity through the act of remembering and recording his personal history. The physical evidence left by medieval prisoners provides archaeological confirmation of the written record's descriptions of dungeon conditions. Excavations at various castle sites have uncovered cells containing layers of human waste, food debris, and personal items that paint a picture of daily life that was even more desperate than contemporary accounts suggested. The discovery of improvised tools, hidden caches of food, and primitive artwork scratched into stone walls reveals the ingenuity and determination that prisoners brought to the challenge of survival. Perhaps most moving are the personal messages that prisoners carved into their cell walls, often in languages or dialects that suggest they were educated individuals who had fallen far from their original social positions. These inscriptions include prayers, declarations of innocence, messages to family members who would never see them, and simple statements of identity that seemed designed to prove to themselves that they still existed as human beings worth remembering. The question of whether you could survive a medieval dungeon ultimately depends not just on your physical constitution or mental fortitude, but on your willingness to become someone fundamentally different from who you were before imprisonment. Survival required abandoning moral principles, betraying fellow prisoners, collaborating with guards, and accepting degradations that would destroy any conventional sense of human dignity. The person, the dungeon, and who entered the person who might eventually emerge were rarely recognizable as the same individual. Those who survived did so not through heroism or virtue, but through a combination of luck, adaptability, and moral flexibility that enabled them to navigate an environment designed to destroy everything human about its inhabitants. They learned to find meaning in small victories, to accept help from unlikely sources, and to provide assistance to others when it served their own survival interests. Most importantly, they learned to endure suffering that would have been unimaginable in their former lives, while maintaining just enough hope to continue the daily struggle for existence. The medieval dungeon represented more than just a method of punishment or detention. It was a comprehensive system designed to demonstrate the absolute power of authority over individual human lives. Every aspect of dungeon life, from the architecture of the cells to the behavior of the guards, was calculated to reinforce the message that resistance to established power was not just futile, but literally unthinkable. The dungeon was a machine for breaking human spirits and transforming people into objects that could be manipulated, exploited, and discarded at will. Understanding this purpose helps explain why medieval dungeons were designed to be survivable, albeit barely. The goal was not simply to kill prisoners quickly, but to demonstrate that even survival was possible only through the mercy and tolerance of those in power. A prisoner who managed to live for years in dungeon conditions served as a more effective example of authority's reach than a corpse would have been. The survival itself became a form of testimony to the absolute nature of medieval power structures. As we consider these historical realities, the question of whether you could survive a medieval dungeon becomes less important than understanding what survival would have cost. The price was not just physical suffering or psychological trauma, but the complete transformation of everything that made you who you were. In the end, the most honest answer might be that while your body might survive a medieval dungeon, you almost certainly would not. The records tell us that survival in a medieval dungeon wasn't just about enduring physical pain or mental anguish. It was about navigating a complex of human relationships that could mean the difference between a quick death and prolonged suffering. The Tower of London's archives reveal cases where prisoners survived not through strength or cunning, but through their ability to make themselves useful to the very people who held their lives in their hands. Consider the case of James I of Scotland, held at various English castles, including Pontefract, for nearly 2 decades. His survival depended entirely on his political value as a bargaining chip. While common prisoners rotted in communal cells, James lived in relative comfort, receiving education, decent meals, and even the opportunity to write poetry. His captors understood that a healthy, educated Scottish king was worth far more than a broken corpse in a dungeon cell. But for every James of Scotland, there were hundreds of unnamed prisoners whose stories survive only in fragments of administrative records. A notation from Warwick Castle mentions payments made to a guard for removing 3 bodies from the oubliette during a single winter month. Another document from the Château de Vincennes records the purchase chains of additional, suggesting that the prison population had grown beyond the capacity of existing restraints. These bureaucratic records, dry as they seem, paint a picture of systematic brutality conducted with the same attention to detail that governed any other aspect of castle administration. Prison supplies were inventoried, guard schedules were maintained, and costs were calculated with the precision of merchants managing a profitable business. Because that's exactly what many medieval prisons had become, profitable businesses built on human misery. The corruption that infected every level of the prison system created opportunities for those clever enough and ruthless enough to exploit them. Prisoners with access to money could purchase privileges that transformed their experience from unbearable to merely horrible. A gold coin might buy a week's worth of decent food. A handful of silver could secure a cell with a small window or access to clean water. But these transactions came with their own dangers, as prisoners who displayed wealth became targets for robbery, extortion, and violence from both guards and fellow inmates. The most successful prison entrepreneurs weren't always those who entered with the most resources. They were the ones who understood how to generate value within the constraints of their environment. A prisoner who could read might offer to write letters for illiterate guards, earning small favors that accumulated over time. Someone with knowledge of herbal medicine could treat minor ailments, building a network of grateful patients who provided protection and shared resources. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life penetrated even the deepest dungeons, bringing changes that could mean survival or death for already weakened prisoners. Winter was paradoxically both the most dangerous and safest time to be imprisoned. The cold was brutal, sometimes literally freezing prisoners to death in their cells. But the same cold that killed the weak also slowed the spread of disease, reduced insect populations, and made the omnipresent stench slightly more bearable. Archaeological evidence from various castle sites confirms the devastating impact of winter conditions on prison populations. Excavations at Château Gaillard revealed layers of human remains that suggest mass die-offs during particularly harsh winters, when even the minimal food rations that kept prisoners alive were reduced to conserve castle supplies. The bones show evidence of malnutrition so severe that some prisoners literally starved to death, while others around them survived on scraps that wouldn't sustain a child. Spring brought flooding that turned dungeons into death traps. The same stone construction that made these prisons escape-proof also made them vulnerable to water damage. When rivers overflowed or heavy rains overwhelmed drainage systems, underground cells filled with contaminated water that carried sewage, dead animals, and toxic waste from the castle above. Prisoners chained to walls might stand in this poisonous soup for weeks, unable to sit or lie down, watching weaker inmates drown in their shackles. The water would eventually recede, but it left behind layers of contaminated mud and organic matter that created perfect breeding conditions for disease. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery would sweep through prison populations in the weeks following major floods, often killing more prisoners than the flooding itself. Those who survived faced months of dealing with infected wounds on their feet and legs, as the contaminated water caused ulcers and gangrene that could prove fatal even after the immediate crisis had passed. Summer brought its own unique torments. The combination of heat, humidity, and poor ventilation created conditions that were barely survivable for healthy individuals, let alone prisoners weakened by malnutrition and disease. Temperatures in stone chambers could reach levels that caused heat stroke and dehydration, while the lack of air circulation made every breath a struggle. Prisoners would strip off whatever clothing they had, desperate for relief, but nakedness brought its own problems, leaving them vulnerable to insect bites, skin infections, and the psychological humiliation of complete exposure. The heat also accelerated decomposition, creating health hazards that affected entire prison populations. Bodies of dead prisoners might remain in cells for days or weeks before guards bothered to remove them, and the resulting stench and disease made adjacent cells uninhabitable. Some prisoners were forced to share their living space with decomposing corpses, an experience that caused psychological trauma lasting long after the bodies were finally removed. Autumn was harvest time, and the quality of prison food improved slightly as fresh grain became available. But autumn also meant preparation for winter, and guards would often reduce prisoner rations to stockpile food for the cold months ahead. The cruel irony was typical of medieval prison logic. Prisoners were starved when food was most abundant to ensure that something would be available when supplies became scarce. The religious calendar that structured medieval life cast its shadow even the deep into Thoas dungeons, ways that Perv often inerted the original spiritual meaning. Christmas might bring slightly better food or temporary suspension of torture sessions, but it could also bring visits from priests demanding confessions of sins that prisoners hadn't committed. These clerical interrogations used spiritual terror as effectively as any physical torture, threatening eternal damnation for those who refused to admit to crimes or implicate fellow prisoners in imaginary conspiracies. Easter celebrations in the world above might mean temporary reprieves from the harshest punishments below, but they also intensified pressure for religious conformity. Prisoners suspected of heresy faced particularly brutal treatment during holy seasons, as their continued resistance to orthodox doctrine was seen as a direct challenge to the sacred calendar itself. Some guards viewed the torture of heretics during religious festivals as acts of devotion that might earn them spiritual merit. The Inquisition's influence on medieval prisons cannot be overstated. Beginning in the 13th century, ecclesiastical courts gained authority over cases involving heresy, witchcraft, and religious dissent. This created a new category of prisoner whose treatment was governed by theological rather than secular considerations. Inquisition prisons were often worse than their civilian counterparts, as they were designed not just to punish, but to extract confessions that would save souls by forcing acknowledgement of sin. The techniques developed by Inquisition interrogators were systematically brutal and psychologically sophisticated. Prisoners might be subjected to weeks of preliminary questioning designed to identify their psychological weaknesses before formal torture began. Sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and carefully orchestrated displays of torture instruments were used to break down resistance before any physical pain was inflicted. The goal was to make prisoners complicit in their own destruction by convincing them that confession was their only path to salvation. Women prisoners in Inquisition custody faced particular horrors that reflected medieval anxieties about female sexuality and spiritual authority. Accusations of witchcraft often involved detailed interrogations about sexual practices, demonic encounters, and participation in imaginary sabbats. The torture techniques used on accused witches were designed to humiliate and degrade as much as to cause pain, reinforcing social hierarchies that placed women firmly under male control. The search for physical evidence of witchcraft led to examinations that were essentially medical torture disguised as legal procedure. Accused witches were subjected to invasive searches for devil's marks, supernatural teats, or other signs of demonic connection. These examinations were conducted by male officials in front of witnesses, stripping away any pretense of dignity or privacy. Many women died from infections caused by these procedures, while others were driven insane by the humiliation and violation. Children in medieval prisons existed in a legal and moral limbo that reflected broader uncertainties about childhood and responsibility. The concept of juvenile justice did not exist, and children as young as 7 could be imprisoned for theft, vagrancy, or simply being related to accused criminals. These young prisoners rarely survived more than a few months, succumbing to diseases that their developing immune systems couldn't fight. The few children who survived longer often did so by attaching themselves to adult prisoners who served as protectors and surrogate parents. These relationships were fraught with danger, as adults might view children as burdens consuming precious resources, or as assets that could be exploited for various purposes. Some children survived by becoming servants to more powerful prisoners, performing tasks that ranged from cleaning and message carrying to more disturbing services that reflected the complete breakdown of normal moral boundaries. The psychological development of children who experienced extended imprisonment was invariably warped by trauma and deprivation. They learned to view violence, exploitation, and degradation as normal aspects of human interaction. Many became incapable of forming healthy emotional attachments, having had their capacity for trust and empathy destroyed during their most formative years. Those who were eventually released often became criminals themselves, having learned no other way to navigate a world they perceived as fundamentally hostile. The economic systems that emerged within prison populations were as complex and ruthless as any found in the commercial world above ground. Prisoners with initial advantages, whether financial resources, useful skills, or valuable information, could establish themselves as power brokers who controlled access to survival necessities. They might loan food to starving inmates at crushing interest rates, charge fees for protection services, or demand payment for sharing knowledge about guard schedules and prison routines. These internal economies operated on currencies that would have been worthless outside prison walls, but became literally life-saving within them. A piece of relatively clean cloth could be traded for crucial information. A small improvised tool might be rented out for specific tasks. Even human waste had economic value, as it could be used to create conditions that forced guards to relocate prisoners to different, possibly better cells. The most successful prison entrepreneurs understood that scarcity created opportunity and worked systematically to control access to anything that might improve survival chances. They formed networks with guards, established relationships with visitors, and created distribution systems for smuggled goods. Some became so integral to prison operations that guards relied on them to maintain order and prevent uprisings that could threaten the entire system. Information was perhaps, and elaborate, the most valuable commodity in medieval prisons' networks developed to collect, verify, and distribute news from the outside world. Prisoners created communication sophisticate systems using codes that could be transmitted through coughing patterns, tapping sequences, or the strategic arrangement of straw and waste in cell corners. These networks allowed warnings about impending raids, shared intelligence about guard rotations, and coordinated resistance to particularly brutal treatment. The most valuable information concerned political developments that might affect individual cases or general prison conditions. A prisoner who understood the broader context of his imprisonment was better positioned to predict changes in treatment, identify opportunities for release, or recognize when escape attempts might be feasible. This knowledge could be traded to other prisoners, sold to guards, or used to negotiate better conditions for oneself or one's allies. Some prisoners became information specialists who made survival their profession by knowing more about prison operations than the guards themselves. They would track guard schedules, monitor food deliveries, observe visitor patterns, and analyze administrative routines to identify weaknesses that could be exploited. This intelligence work required careful observation, reliable memory, and the ability to synthesize disparate pieces of information into actionable knowledge. The medical knowledge that developed within prison populations was necessarily crude, but often surprisingly effective, given the limited resources available. Prisoners learned to recognize early symptoms of common diseases, treat wounds with improvised materials, and provide comfort care for the dying. This knowledge was passed down through informal mentoring relationships that created medical traditions spanning generations of prisoners. Some inmates discovered methods for obtaining herbal medicines through bribery or smuggling, establishing themselves as prison doctors who treated fellow prisoners in exchange for protection, food, or other considerations. These amateur physicians worked without proper tools or pharmaceutical supplies, using techniques that were often as dangerous as the conditions they attempted to treat. But even inadequate medical care was better than none, and prisoners who could provide healing services often found themselves protected by coalitions of grateful patients. The psychological coping mechanisms that prisoners developed to maintain sanity were as varied as the individuals who created them. Some found refuge in religious practices, spending hours each day in prayer, meditation, or recitation of memorized scripture. Others focused on intellectual activities, composing poetry, solving mathematical problems, or creating elaborate mental constructions that provided escape from physical reality. Many prisoners developed detailed fantasy worlds populated by family members, friends, and imaginary companions who provided the emotional connections that prison life denied. These internal relationships were often more real to prisoners than their actual interactions with guards and fellow inmates. Some would carry on elaborate conversations with these mental companions, creating rich narratives that provided meaning and purpose in an environment designed to strip away both. The most psychologically resilient prisoners were often those who found ways to help others, whether through sharing scarce resources, providing medical care, or simply offering emotional support to newer inmates struggling with their initial adjustment to prison conditions. This altruistic behavior served multiple purposes. It created social bonds that provided protection and support. It maintained connections to moral values that helped preserve identity. And it gave prisoners a sense of purpose that transcended mere survival. But altruism in medieval prisons always came with costs and risks. Helping others meant sharing resources that might be needed for personal survival. It could make prisoners targets for exploitation by those who viewed kindness as weakness. And it required emotional investment in relationships that might be severed at any moment by death, transfer, or the arbitrary decisions of prison authorities. The question of survival ultimately comes down to a fundamental transformation of identity and values that few people could accomplish without losing essential aspects of their humanity. The medieval dungeon was designed not just to punish specific crimes, but to demonstrate the absolute power of authority over individual. Every aspect of prison life, from human existence, the architecture of the cells, to the behavior of the guards, reinforced the message that resistance was not just futile, but literally inconceivable. Those who survived did so by learning to navigate systems of power and exploitation that required abandoning conventional moral principles and social norms. They became experts in reading human psychology under extreme stress, understanding when to submit and when to assert themselves, when to help others, and when to protect their own interests above all else. These skills came at the cost of everything that had previously defined them as individuals, worthy of respect and dignity. The records show us that survival was possible, but only for those willing to pay prices that transform them into fundamentally different people. The person who entered the dungeon and the person who might eventually emerge were rarely recognizable as the same individual. In many cases, the question isn't whether you could survive a medieval dungeon, but whether you would want to survive as the person you would necessarily have to become. The archaeological record reveals something that contemporary documents often obscured: the sheer randomness of medieval justice. Excavations at sites like Pontefract Castle have uncovered evidence of prisoners who died within days of arrival alongside remains showing signs of decades-long confinement. The difference between these fates often had nothing to do with the severity of crimes or the strength of evidence. Instead, survival frequently depended on factors as arbitrary as which guard happened to be on duty when you arrived, or whether your imprisonment coincided with a good harvest that kept everyone in slightly better spirits. The administrative records that survive from places like the Tower of London paint a picture of bureaucratic indifference that was perhaps more chilling than outright cruelty. Clerks would note the delivery of prisoners with the same detached precision they used to record shipments of grain or payments to craftsmen. A typical entry might read, "Received this day one William Miller, accused of seditious speech, chained in the lower ward." There would be no further mention of William Miller until perhaps months later, when another clerk would note, "Removed one corpse from the lower ward, identity unknown." This bureaucratic machinery operated with clockwork efficiency, processing human beings as if they were inventory to be stored, maintained, or disposed of as circumstances required. The very language used in these records stripped prisoners of their humanity, reducing them to numbers, categories, and logistical problems to be solved by men who had learned to view suffering as simply another aspect of castle administration. The Tower of London's records are particularly revealing because they document the treatment of prisoners across all social levels. While noble Charles prisoners of Orleans Duke, lived in chambers that were essentially comfortable apartments, the Tower's underground levels housed hundreds of common prisoners in conditions that barely sustained life. The contrast was stark and deliberate, designed to reinforce social hierarchies even in the depths of imprisonment. The Duke of Orleans spent 25 years in English captivity, much of it in the Tower, where he wrote poetry, received visitors, and conducted correspondence. Meanwhile, prisoners in the cells below him were dying from diseases that could have been prevented with basic sanitation and adequate food. This wasn't oversight or resource scarcity. It was a calculated demonstration of the value that medieval society placed on different categories of human life. The architectural evidence tells us that these disparities were built into the very structure of medieval prisons. Excavations at various castle sites reveal clear divisions between areas designed for different classes of prisoners. Noble quarters featured stone floors that could be cleaned, windows that provided light and ventilation, and access to private latrines. Common cells were carved directly into bedrock, with no provision for sanitation and no source of natural light. But even among common prisoners, subtle hierarchies emerged based on factors that had little to do with their original social status. A merchant who could read and write might achieve higher standing than a knight who had been stripped of his wealth and connections. An elderly prisoner who had survived for years commanded respect and fear in equal measure, having learned the unwritten rules that governed life in the depths. These prison hierarchies were constantly shifting as circumstances changed and new prisoners arrived. The death of a protective guard could overnight transform a relatively privileged prisoner into a target for exploitation. Political changes in the world above could elevate some prisoners while condemning others to worse treatment. The arrival of new inmates with valuable skills or information could disrupt existing alliances and force everyone to renegotiate their position within the social structure. The most successful prisoners understood that survival required constant vigilance and adaptation. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated changes in guard moods, prison policies, or political winds that might affect their treatment. They formed alliances that provided mutual benefit while avoiding dependencies that could become liabilities. Most importantly, they recognized that maintaining their position often required making moral compromises that would have been unthinkable in their previous lives. The corruption that infected every level of the prison system created opportunities for those clever enough to exploit them, but it also introduced new dangers that could prove fatal. A prisoner who had bribed his way to better conditions might find himself targeted for robbery by guards who knew he had hidden resources. Someone who had informed on fellow prisoners to earn favors might discover that his reputation made him a pariah whose former protectors were no longer willing to shield him from retaliation. The most dangerous position in any medieval prison was that of the informant who had outlived his usefulness. Guards would encourage prisoners to spy on each other, offering food, medicine, or better accommodations in exchange for information about escape plans, hidden resources, or conversations that might be construed as seditious. But informants who provided too much information too eagerly often found themselves viewed with suspicion by their handlers, who understood that someone willing to betray fellow prisoners might eventually betray guards as well. The psychology of survival in these conditions required fundamental changes in personality and worldview that few people could accomplish without losing essential aspects of their humanity. Prisoners had to learn to compartmentalize their emotions, suppressing empathy and compassion that might interfere with the ruthless calculations necessary for staying alive. They developed hypervigilance that made them constantly aware of threats and opportunities. But this same alertness often made normal human interactions impossible. The religious framework that governed medieval life provided some prisoners with coping mechanisms, but it also created additional sources of torment. Faith could offer comfort and meaning in the face of suffering, but it could also intensify guilt and despair when prisoners were forced to commit acts that violated their deepest moral convictions. The knowledge that survival might require betraying fellow humans, stealing food from the dying, or collaborating with brutal guards created spiritual crises that were as devastating as any physical torture. Some prisoners found refuge in madness, retreating into fantasy worlds that provided escape from unbearable reality. Guards learned to recognize the signs of this psychological withdrawal and often encouraged it, understanding that insane prisoners posed less threat of escape or rebellion. The line between strategic madness and genuine psychological breakdown was often impossible to discern, even for the prisoners themselves. Others maintained their sanity through elaborate mental exercises that kept their minds active and engaged. They would compose poetry, solve mathematical problems, or create detailed mental maps of places they had visited in their former lives. These intellectual activities served multiple purposes. They provided distraction from physical discomfort, maintained cognitive function that might be needed for survival, and preserved connections to identities that prison life was designed to destroy. The seasonal cycles that governed life in the castle above had profound but unpredictable effects on conditions below. A harsh winter might mean reduced food rations as supplies ran low, but it might also mean fewer visitors and less activity in the castle, leading to periods of relative calm in the prison areas. Spring floods could be catastrophic, but they might also provide opportunities for prisoners with the knowledge and courage to exploit the chaos. The most experienced prisoners learn to read these seasonal patterns and adjust their survival strategies accordingly. They would hoard resources during times of plenty, seek alliances that would provide protection during dangerous periods, and position themselves to take advantage of opportunities that arose from changing conditions. This long-term thinking required a level of strategic planning that was difficult to maintain while dealing with the immediate pressures of hunger, disease, and violence. The records from medieval prisons reveal patterns of survival that had little to do with the virtues that were celebrated in the world above ground. Courage, honor, and loyalty were often liabilities that interfered with the pragmatic calculations necessary for staying alive. Instead, successful prisoners tended to be those who could adapt quickly to changing circumstances, who understood human psychology under stress, and who were willing to abandon conventional morality when survival was at stake. The most chilling aspect of these historical records is not the brutality they document, but the systematic nature of that brutality. Medieval dungeons weren't chaotic places where violence erupted randomly. They were carefully managed institutions where suffering was regulated, measured, and dispensed according to complex calculations that took into account political necessity, economic benefit, and social control. The guards who administered this system weren't sadistic monsters acting on impulse. They were professionals doing a job that society not only tolerated but required. This institutional nature of medieval imprisonment helps explain why survival was so difficult and why those who did survive were so fundamentally changed by the experience. The system was designed to break human spirits methodically and thoroughly, using techniques that had been refined over generations of practice. Resistance wasn't just futile, it was literally inconceivable within the framework of assumptions that governed prison life. The question of whether you could survive a medieval dungeon ultimately depends not just on your physical constitution or mental fortitude, but on your willingness to become complicit in a system that was designed to destroy everything human about its inhabitants. Survival required not just enduring suffering, but participating in the mechanisms that created that suffering for others. It meant making moral compromises that fundamentally altered who you were as a person. Those who emerged from medieval dungeons, if they emerged at all, carried scars that went far deeper than the physical marks left by chains and torture devices. They had been transformed by experiences that challenged every assumption about human nature, social justice, and the meaning of survival itself. The person who walked out of those stone chambers was rarely recognizable as the same individual who had entered them, even to themselves. The historical record suggests that survival was indeed possible, but only at costs that most people would find unacceptable. The price wasn't just years of physical suffering or psychological trauma, but the complete transformation of everything that had previously defined you as a human being worthy to be dungeon represent. The most you could survive a medieval dungeon might to weather many ways and respect. In would not of dignity answered you, there'd the logical where the abstract body might medieval your in life governed medieval, obedience, and control system that valued hierarchy. The above individual person you have honest human principles extreme social over that be that. While it was a place society were reduced to their most brutal and concrete forms, where the distance between lord and peasant was measured not in social customs or economic relationships, but in the difference between a quick death and prolonged agony. Understanding this context helps explain why medieval dungeons were designed the way they were, and why survival within them required such fundamental changes in personality and values. They weren't just punishment facilities or detention centers, but instruments of social control that demonstrated the absolute power of authority over individual human existence. Every aspect of prison life, from the architecture of the cells to the corruption of the guards, served to reinforce the message that resistance to established power was not just futile, but literally unthinkable. As we close this journey into one of history's darkest chapters, we're left with uncomfortable questions about the nature of survival, the price of resistance, and the ways that extreme circumstances can transform human beings into something unrecognizable. The medieval dungeon may seem like a relic of a brutal past, but the psychological mechanisms it exploited, the social dynamics it created, and the moral compromises it demanded remain disturbingly relevant to understanding how ordinary people respond to extraordinary pressures. The stone walls may have crumbled and the iron chains may have rusted away, but the lessons carved into those dark chambers continue to echo through time, whispering uncomfortable truths about the fragility of human dignity and the terrible creativity of those who would destroy it. In the end, the question isn't just whether you could survive a medieval dungeon, but whether you could survive it as someone you could still recognize as yourself. The weight of chains becomes your constant companion, their rhythm marking time in a place where time itself has lost all meaning. Every shift of position sends iron grinding against bone. Every breath carries the taste of despair mixed with the metallic tang of blood. This is your reality now, measured not in days or weeks, but in the slow erosion of everything you once believed about human dignity and the value of life. The administrative machinery that had delivered you to this place operated with the same cold efficiency used to manage any other aspect of castle business. Your name was recorded in ledgers alongside entries for grain deliveries and payments to craftsmen. The clerk who noted your arrival showed no more emotion than when documenting the purchase of horseshoes or candles. You had become inventory, a problem to be stored until someone decided what to do with you. The process of classification began immediately. Guards assessed your potential value, your ability to pay bribes, your likelihood of survival. These calculations determined everything from your cell assignment to your food rations. A prisoner with wealthy relatives might find himself in a cell with a small windowed, regular meals. Someone with no resources and no political value would disappear into the deepest chambers where screams went unheard and bodies were forgotten until they began to stink. Your fellow prisoners represented every level of medieval society, though prison had a way of stripping away the distinctions that had once seemed so important. The knight-D the Who had back-wrong claimant to the throne shared space with the merchant who had refused to pay excessive taxes. The priest accused of heresy lay chained beside the peasant who had poached deer from the Lord's forest. Disease and despair were great equalizers that recognized no social boundaries. The guards who controlled your fate were men shaped by violence and hardened by necessity. Many were former soldiers whose injuries had made them unfit for active duty. Others were criminals themselves, offered the choice between hanging and employment in the castle's depths. A few were simply desperate men with families to feed, who had discovered that steady wages could be earned from human misery, regardless of the moral cost. These men lived in a world suspended between the civilized castle above and the hell they administered below. They slept in cramped quarters near the prison cells, breathing the same poisoned air and listening to the same sounds of suffering night after night. To maintain their sanity, they had to convince themselves that their charges deserved their fate, that justice was being served in the darkness below ground. The corruption that flourished in this environment was as predictable as sunrise. Guards earning barely enough to survive discovered families that desperate would pay anything for news of imprisoned relatives. A few copper coins might buy information about whether a loved one was still alive. Silver could secure the delivery of a message or a small portion of decent food. Gold might purchase a cell with slightly better conditions or temporary relief from the worst abuses. This underground economy operated according to its own brutal logic. Hope was a commodity more valuable than bread, and guards learned to portion it out carefully to maximize their profits. They might tell a family that their imprisoned relative was doing well when he was actually dying, collecting payments for fictitious improvements in conditions that existed only in their imagination. The most successful guards became entrepreneurs of suffering, establishing relationships with moneylenders, merchants, and fixers who could help them converted wealth into legitimate property and social advancement. Some retired from dungeon work as prosperous men, having built comfortable lives on of human ag foundations only. Others drank themselves to death, unable to escape the psychological toll of their profession, even after accumulating enough wealth to live without working. The physical architecture of your prison cell was itself a form of torture, designed by men who understood that environment could break spirits as effectively as any rack or wheel. The walls wept constantly, moisture seeping through stone that had been deliberately chosen for its ability to retain dampness and cold. This perpetual humidity, the growth of molds encouraged and fungi that filled the air with spores, attacking lungs already weakened by malnutrition and stress. The floor beneath your feet was packed earth that had been soaked with decades of human waste, blood, and worse substances that you preferred not to identify. Every step released odors that would have been unbearable in your former life, but had now become the normal atmosphere of your existence. The earth itself seemed contaminated, poisoned by the accumulated suffering of countless prisoners who had walked this same ground before disappearing into death or madness. Ventilation was virtually non-existent, creating an atmosphere thick with toxic gases that made every breath a struggle. The few air shafts that existed were narrow and often blocked, designed more to prevent escape than to provide fresh air. You learned to breathe shallowly, conserving your strength while trying to avoid inhaling too deeply of that felt air more like poison than life-sustaining oxygen. The darkness was absolute and crushing, a physical presence that seemed to have weight and malevolent intent. Your eyes, starved of light, began to create their own images after weeks of total blackness. Hallucinations became common companions, more real than the stone walls that surrounded you. Some prisoners welcomed these visions as relief from the monotony of darkness, while others feared them as signs of approaching madness. The restraints that bound you were masterpieces of deliberate, no-take cruelty, designed just to prevent escape, but to cause constant pain that would gradually destroy your will to resist. Iron shackles weighing 35 pounds or more were clamped around your ankles, their weight making every movement an exhausting effort. The metal was rough and unfinished, guaranteed to rub against skin and bone until open wounds developed that would never heal properly in the filthy conditions. Your wrists were bound with chains that allowed just enough movement to prevent your hands from dying completely, but not enough to perform any useful tasks or find comfortable positions for rest. The iron had been deliberately sized to be too small, ensuring constant pressure that gradually cut off circulation and caused permanent damage to joints and tendons. Every gesture became a reminder of your powerlessness, every attempt to ease your discomfort only tightening the bonds that held you. The positions you were forced to maintain were calculated to maximize suffering while keeping you alive. Some prisoners were chained standing against walls, unable to sit or lie down for days at a time. Others were forced into crouching positions that caused excruciating muscle cramps and joint pain that intensified with every passing hour. The chains were always kept just short enough to prevent any comfortable arrangement of limbs, ensuring that exhaustion became another form of torture. Water became the most precious substance in your reduced world, more valuable than gold or silver in the life you had left behind. Your daily ration, when it came at all, might consist of a single cup of liquid that had sat in dirty containers for days before reaching you. The water often carried the taste of metal from rusty vessels, or worse flavors that suggested contamination with substances you preferred not to contemplate. The desperate thirst that became your constant companion drove you to extremes that would have been unthinkable in your former existence. You learned to position yourself to catch condensation dripping from stone walls, licking moisture from the very stones of your prison, despite knowing that the water carried whatever poisons leached from the contaminated mortar. Some prisoners resorted to drinking their own urine when no other liquid was available, a practice that provided temporary relief but accelerated their journey toward death. The guards understood that water was power, and they wielded that power with casual cruelty that revealed their complete indifference to human suffering. They might withhold your ration for days as punishment for imaginary infractions, or demand additional bribes from desperate family members before providing even the most basic hydration. Some took pleasure in drinking clean water in front of parched prisoners, demonstrating their absolute control over life and death in the most fundamental way possible. Food, when it appeared, bore little resemblance to anything that might have sustained life in the world above ground. Your daily meal, if you were fortunate enough to receive one, typically consisted of a small piece of bread so hard and mouldy that it required soaking in whatever liquid you possessed before it could be chewed. The bread was often green with mold, crawling with insects, or riddled with holes left by rats that had gotten to it before you. The thin gruel that sometimes accompanied your bread was made from scraps that had been deemed inedible by the castle's pigs. It might contain fragments of spoiled meat, rotten vegetables, or grain so contaminated that it posed serious health risks to anyone desperate enough to consume it. But hunger had become such an overwhelming obsession that you learned to pick out the worst contamination while consuming whatever nutrients remained, no matter how revolting the source. The starvation that defined your existence was carefully calculated to weaken your body while keeping you alive long enough to serve whatever purpose your captors had in mind. Your muscles wasted away, your bones became visible through increasingly translucent skin, and your mind began to focus obsessively on food to the exclusion of almost everything else. Dreams of elaborate feasts became more real than the stone walls around you, and you caught yourself conducting detailed conversations about meals you had enjoyed in your previous life. The diseases that swept through prison populations moved like invisible armies, striking down prisoners already weakened by starvation and despair. Tuberculosis was perhaps the most feared killer, beginning with a persistent cough that gradually worsened until you were spitting up blood and wasting away to nothing. The close quarters and poor ventilation made the disease incredibly contagious, and you watched fellow prisoners succumb one by one to an ailment that turned breathing itself into agony. Dysentery struck with sudden violence, causing uncontrollable diarrhea and vomiting that could kill within days' spray. The disease through contaminated food and water, turning your already inadequate rations into weapons that attacked from within. The dehydration and blood loss caused by dysentery were particularly devastating for prisoners who were already malnourished and had no access to medical care or clean replacement fluids. Skin diseases flourished in the filthy conditions, creating additional layers of torment for prisoners who were already struggling with the basic challenges of survival. Scabies caused intense itching and infected sores that never had a chance to heal properly. Lice infested whatever clothing remained, carrying typhus and other diseases, while creating constant irritation that made rest impossible. Even minor cuts or scrapes could become life-threatening infections without proper care or clean dressings. The psychological symptoms that developed during prolonged imprisonment were as devastating as any physical disease. Modern research on solitary confinement shows that over 90% of isolated prisoners develop severe anxiety and nervousness, while 70% experience symptoms of impending nervous breakdown. You found yourself talking to imaginary companions, conducting elaborate conversations with people who existed only in your fractured mind, creating entire fantasy worlds to escape the unbearable reality of your situation. Sleep became either impossible or your only refuge from consciousness. Some prisoners developed severe insomnia, lying awake in the darkness for days at a time with minds racing through fears, memories, and increasingly disconnected into sleep-deprived thoughts. Others retreat as much as possible, sometimes remaining unconscious for 20 hours a day in desperate attempts to escape their circumstances through unconsciousness. Both extremes were dangerous, as sleep deprivation weakened immune systems, while excessive sleep led to muscle deterioration and further psychological breakdown. The arrival of new prisoners provided the only variation in your monotonous existence, bringing fresh information about the outside world, along with new opportunities for both cooperation and exploitation. Newcomers represented potential sources of news about family members, political developments, or changes in the world above that might affect your own situation. They also carried whatever possessions they had managed to retain, making them targets for robbery and extortion by prisoners who had learned that survival often required taking from others. The initiation rituals that veteran prisoners imposed on newcomers served multiple purposes beyond simple entertainment in a world devoid of diversion. These tests determined where new arrivals would fit in the established hierarchy, what resources they might contribute to the prison community, and whether they possessed the psychological flexibility necessary for long-term survival. The process was often brutal and humiliating, designed to strip away whatever dignity remained from their former lives. The social dynamics that emerged within prison populations created complex networks of alliance and betrayal that resembled the political structures of the world above, but compressed and intensified by the extreme conditions. Prisoners formed protective relationships based on mutual benefit, sharing scarce resources and information in exchange for security and companionship. But these alliances were always fragile, subject to dissolution when circumstances changed or when survival required betraying former friends. The most successful prisoners were those who learned to navigate these treacherous social waters while maintaining their focus on the primary goal of staying alive. They understood when to help others and when to protect their own interests above all else. They recognized that moral principles were luxuries that few could afford in an environment where any display of weakness could be fatal. Most importantly, they accepted that survival often required making compromises that fundamentally altered who they were as human beings. The corruption that infected every aspect of prison life created opportunities for those clever enough to exploit them, but it also introduced new dangers that could prove fatal for the unwary. A prisoner who had bribed his way to better conditions might find himself targeted by guards who knew he possessed hidden resources. Someone who had informed on fellow prisoners might discover that his reputation made him a pariah whose former protectors were no longer willing to provide assistance. The information networks that developed within prison populations were remarkably sophisticated, allowing news and warnings to spread rapidly through communities of people who were supposedly isolated from each other. Prisoners created communication systems using codes that could be transmitted through patterns of coughing, tapping sequences, or the strategic arrangement of waste materials in cell corners. These networks provided early warning of raids, shared intelligence about guard schedules, and coordinated responses to threats that could affect the entire prison population. The seasonal rhythms that governed life in the castle above had profound effects on conditions in the dungeons below, creating cycles of hardship that prisoners learned to anticipate and prepare for as much as their limited resources allowed. Winter brought bone-chilling cold that penetrated the thickest stone walls, forcing prisoners to huddle together for warmth that might mean the difference between life and death. The cold made every other aspect of imprisonment worse, turning damp clothes into instruments of torture and making already inadequate food even harder to digest. Spring floods posed existential threats to prisoners confined below ground level, as contaminated water would pour into cells and rise to dangerous levels that could persist for weeks. You might find yourself standing in knee-deep water, filled with sewage and waste from the castle above, unable to sit or lie down, watching weaker drown in prisoners, their chains. The floods brought diseases that could devastate entire prison populations, while the contaminated water caused infections and ulcers that might prove fatal months after it passed. Summer, the immediate crisis, her heat combined with poor ventilation, created conditions that approached the limits of human endurance, particularly for prisoners and by malnutrition and disease weak. Temperatures in stone chambers could reach levels that caused heatstroke and dehydration, while the lack of air circulation made every breath a struggle against air that felt thick and poisonous. The heat also accelerated decomposition, creating health hazards when dead prisoners remained in cells for extended periods before guards bothered to remove them. The religious framework that structured medieval society provided some prisoners with psychological resources for coping with their suffering. But it also created additional sources of torment for those whose circumstances forced them to violate their deepest moral convictions. Faith, comfort, and offer could meaning in the face of seemingly pointless suffering, but it could also intensify guilt and despair when survival required actions that contradicted everything you had been taught about right and wrong. The priests who visited medieval dungeons brought both hope and terror in roughly equal measure. Some genuinely sought to provide spiritual comfort and practical assistance, smuggling food and medicine while advocating for better treatment from prison authorities. These clerics risked their own careers and safety by showing mercy to condemned criminals, and their efforts occasionally made crucial differences for prisoners who had been abandoned by everyone else. But many clerical visits were less benevolent, as priests were often sent to extract confessions that would justify harsh sentences or implicate other suspects in imaginary crimes. They wielded spiritual terror as effectively as any torturer, threatening eternal damnation for prisoners who refused to admit guilt or cooperate with investigations. The knowledge that resistance might condemn your soul, as well as your body, created psychological pressures that were often more effective than physical torture. The Inquisition's influence on medieval imprisonment cannot be understated, as ecclesiastical courts gained authority over cases involving heresy, witchcraft, and religious dissent. Prisoners accused of these crimes faced treatment that was governed by theological rather than secular considerations, designed not just to punish, but to extract confessions that would supposedly save souls by forcing acknowledgement of sin. The techniques developed by Inquisition interrogators were systematically brutal and psychologically sophisticated, using sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and carefully orchestrated displays of torture instruments to break down resistance before physical pain was even inflicted. Women prisoners faced additional horrors that reflected medieval anxieties about female sexuality and spiritual authority. Accusations of witchcraft often involved detailed interrogations about sexual practices and supernatural encounters. The search, while for physical evidence, led to examinations that were essentially medical torture disguised as legal procedure. These invasive searches were conducted by male officials in front of witnesses, stripping away any pretense of dignity, while often causing infections that could prove fatal in the unsanitary prison environment. Children who found themselves in medieval prisons existed in a legal and moral limbo that reflected broader uncertainties about childhood and criminal responsibility. The concept of juvenile justice did not exist, and children as young as 7 could be imprisoned for theft, vagrancy, or simply having the misfortune to be related to accused criminals. These young prisoners rarely survived more than a few months, succumbing to diseases that their developing immune systems were unable to fight effectively. The economic systems that emerged within prison populations were as ruthless and complex as any found in the legitimate commercial world above ground. Prisoners with initial advantages could establish themselves as power brokers who controlled access to survival necessities, while those without initial advantages could not. Resources found themselves subjected to exploitation that made their already desperate circumstances even worse. These internal economies operated on currencies that would have been worthless outside prison walls, but became literally life-saving within the confined world of the dungeons. The question of survival ultimately comes down to a fundamental transformation that few people could accomplish without losing essential aspects of their humanity. The medieval dungeon was designed not just to punish specific crimes, but to demonstrate the absolute power of authority over individual human existence. Every aspect of prison life reinforced the message that resistance was not just futile, but literally inconceivable within the framework of assumptions that governed this underground world. Those who managed to survive did so by learning to navigate systems of power and exploitation that required abandoning conventional moral principles and social norms. They became experts in reading human psychology under extreme stress, understanding when to submit and when to assert themselves, when to help others, and when to protect their own interests above all else. These skills came at the cost of everything that had previously defined them as individuals deserving of respect and dignity. The person who entered the dungeon and the person who might eventually emerge were rarely recognizable as the same individual, even to themselves. The transformation was so complete that survival itself became a form of testimony to the absolute nature of medieval power structures. In many cases, the question isn't whether you could survive a medieval dungeon, but whether you would want to survive as the person you would necessarily have to become. The records that survive from these dark places whisper uncomfortable truths about the fragility of human dignity and the terrible creativity of those who would destroy it. They remind us that the between civilization and barbarism is often distance measured not in centuries or miles, but in the simple presence or absence of light, hope, and the basic recognition that human life has value beyond its utility to those in power. As the final echoes of your footsteps fade into the stone corridors of history, the question remains suspended in the darkness, like the last breath of a dying prisoner. Could you survive a medieval dungeon? The answer lies not in the strength of your body or the courage of your heart, but in your willingness to surrender everything that makes you human in exchange for the simple, brutal fact of continued existence. The stones beneath your feet tell stories in languages you wish you couldn't understand. Every crack holds the memory of blood, every crevice the echo of final prayers, whispered by voices that have long since fallen silent. You've learned to read these walls like scripture, interpreting the scratches left by fingernails worn down to bone, the stains that map out decades of human suffering in shades of brown and black that never quite fade. The Tower of London's records speak of prisoners who carved their names so deep into stone that the letters outlived their makers by centuries. Thomas Culpeper, executed in 1541, left inscriptions that guards discovered still bleeding fresh stone dust years after his death. These weren't acts of vandalism, but desperate attempts to prove existence in a place designed to erase you completely. Every mark was a rebellion against forgetting, a refusal to disappear without leaving some trace that you had once been human. Your fellow prisoners had become walking libraries of pain, each carrying stories written in scars and broken bones. The merchant who'd refused to pay King John's excessive taxes bore the marks of the Judas cradle on his body, permanent reminders of the pyramid-shaped device that had slowly pierced his flesh over the course of 3 agonizing days. His survival had been accidental, a bureaucratic error that saved his life when officials forgot he was still being tortured and moved on to other victims. The priest accused of heresy carried different wounds, psychological rather than physical, from months of interrogation designed to break his faith rather than his body. Inquisition specialists had forced him to watch as other prisoners were subjected to the strappado, their arms dislocated as they were hoisted by ropes tied behind their backs. The priest who conducted these sessions explained patiently that his suffering was necessary for salvation, that confession would free his soul even as it condemned his flesh. Archaeological excavations at Château de Vincennes have uncovered evidence of the systematic brutality that defined medieval imprisonment. Layers of human remains show clear patterns of malnutrition, disease, and violence that confirm the written records' descriptions of dungeon conditions. Chemical analysis of soil samples reveals concentrations of lead, mercury, and other toxic substances that prisoners were forced to ingest through contaminated food and water, creating additional health hazards beyond the obvious threats of starvation and disease. The corruption that governed every aspect of prison life had evolved into a complex economic system that resembled legitimate commerce in its sophistication, if not its morality. Master jailers like those who managed the tower's dungeons operated what were essentially businesses, charging fees for everything from basic food to protection from other prisoners. The rate structure was carefully calculated, with prices set just high enough to extract maximum profit while keeping hope alive for desperate families. A typical price list from Westminster Palace dungeons in the 14th century shows the systematic nature of this exploitation. Clean water cost 1 penny per cup, roughly equivalent to a day's wages for a common labourer. A loaf of bread, free of mould or insects, commanded 2 pennies, while a message delivered to family members might cost a week's income for an ordinary craftsman. These weren't arbitrary prices, but carefully calibrated amounts designed to bankrupt families slowly rather than immediately, ensuring a steady stream of revenue over extended periods. The guards who administered this system were themselves products of a society that had normalized violence as a tool of governance. Many were veterans of the 100 Years' War, men who had learned to view human suffering as simply another aspect of professional duty. They brought military discipline to their work, organizing torture sessions with the same attention to detail they had once applied to siege warfare. Some kept detailed records of prisoner responses to various techniques, creating informal manuals that were passed down through generations of professional torturers. The rack operators at the Tower of London were particularly skilled craftsmen who understood that their work required precision rather than brute force. They knew exactly how much tension to apply to dislocate joints without causing immediate death, how to stretch ligaments just to the point of permanent damage while keeping victims conscious and capable of speech. These specialists commanded higher wages than ordinary guards, their expertise making them valuable assets in the medieval justice system. The wooden horse torture device required different skills, as operators had to calculate weights and positioning to maximize pain while avoiding fatal internal injuries. Prisoners were forced to straddle a sharp-edged beam with weights tied to their legs, creating pressure that gradually crushed internal organs. The process could continue for days if properly managed, with victims remaining conscious throughout their ordeal. Records from French dungeons describe prisoners who survived this treatment for over a week. Their bodies permanently damaged, but their minds intact enough to provide the confessions that justified their torture. The most psychologically devastating torture device was the Judas cradle, named after the apostle who betrayed Christ and used to extract confessions from prisoners accused of betrayal or treason. The pyramid-shaped device was designed so that victims would be slowly lowered onto its point, which would gradually pierce intimate areas of their anatomy. The process could be prolonged indefinitely by adjusting the rate of descent, with some prisoners remaining impaled for days while interrogators extracted information or confessions. So there you have it, the brutal, unforgiving reality of medieval imprisonment laid bare. The question we started with, could you survive a medieval dungeon, has no simple answer, because survival itself was never simple. It required a complete transformation of everything you believed about humanity, morality, and the value of life itself. The archaeological evidence, the administrative records, the physical remains of these stone chambers all tell the same story. Medieval dungeons weren't just prisons. They were machines designed to break human beings systematically and thoroughly. Those few who emerged did so as fundamentally different people, carrying scars that went far deeper than the marks left by chains and torture devices. Perhaps the most chilling truth is that this system worked exactly as intended. It maintained order through terror, crushed dissent through suffering, and demonstrated the absolute power of authority over individual existence. The stones may have crumbled, and the iron may have rusted away, but the lessons carved into those dark chambers continue to echo through history, reminding us how quickly civilization can dissolve when power operates without restraint. The next time you flip a light switch or turn on a tap, remember the darkness we've explored tonight. Remember that human dignity is not a given, but a fragile thing that must be protected. And perhaps ask yourself, in your comfortable modern world, what freedoms you take for granted that countless souls in medieval dungeons died hoping to see just one more time.